Story 1. The Weaver's Echo. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a folklorist whose life was a tapestry woven from the threads of ancient myths and local legends, harbored a healthy academic skepticism. Jinn, fae, boggarts. She saw them as psychological constructs, reflections of human anxieties projected onto the unknown. Her recent commission, however, had begun to fray the edges of that conviction. She had been hired by the National Trust to catalog and preserve the forgotten folklore of Aberystwyth, a remote, mist-shrouded village nestled deep in the Welsh mountains. Specifically, she was tasked with documenting the oral traditions surrounding the Weaver's House, an ancient cottage perched precariously on the edge of a deep ravine known as Twm Dhu, the Black Valley. The cottage, untouched for over a century, was a relic of a time when the mountains held more than just sheep. The village elders, their faces weathered like the stones of the mountains themselves, spoke of the house in hushed, fearful tones. They told tales of Alara, a weaver of unparalleled skill, whose fabrics were said to capture the very essence of the moors, the mist, the wind, the cry of lost souls. But Alara, they whispered, had attracted the attention of something ancient, something that dwelled in the Twm Dhu, something other. They called it Ir Hen Derbynud, the old receiver, a spirit of the land, an entity that gathered and held on to things, especially grief and memory. Eleanor, a pragmatist, believed it was a localized folk memory of a tragic figure, perhaps a victim of the harsh mountain life. The cottage itself was a squat gray stone structure, its roof thick with moss, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the perpetual mist. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp, earth, peat smoke, and a faint cloying sweetness, like withered wildflowers, a scent that seemed to cling to her clothes even after she left. The silence within its walls was profound, almost physical, broken only by the incessant drumming of the rain on the slate roof. Her first few days were spent meticulously documenting the cottage's contents. An ancient loom stood silent in the main room, its threads long rotted away. Spinning wheels, bobbins, and bundles of raw wool lay scattered as if the weaver had just stepped away. And everywhere, a chilling cold that penetrated her thick woolens, a cold that seemed to emanate from the very stone, even when she had a fire roaring in the hearth. She started having dreams. Vivid, disturbing dreams. She would be in the cottage, but it was alive, vibrant, filled with the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a loom. A woman with long, dark hair, Alara, would be weaving, her fingers dancing across the threads. But her face would be etched with a profound, consuming sorrow, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. And in the corner of the room, just at the edge of her vision, a shadowy, indistinct form would be watching, its presence a cold weight. Eleanor dismissed them as occupational hazards. Then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible above the wind. Sibilant, fragmented syllables like words caught on a distant breeze, always just beyond comprehension. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the stones of the cottage itself. She attributed it to auditory pareidolia, her brain trying to make sense of random sounds. One evening, working late in the cottage, documenting an exquisitely preserved, half-woven tapestry still on the loom, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were words, a low, guttural murmur interspersed with a thin, reedy wail. Mine, mine. The guttural voice rasped, trapped, lost. The reedy voice pleaded. Eleanor froze, her pencil hovering over her notepad. Her academic skepticism, usually an impenetrable shield, began to crack. This was not wind. This was not pareidolia. This was intelligent. She grabbed her powerful torch and swept its beam across the room. Nothing. Just the shadows dancing. The sounds ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with unspoken things. She spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, a heavy geological text clutched in her hands, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, trying to find a rational explanation for the irrational. The next morning, driven by a perverse mix of fear and professional curiosity, she sought out the oldest villager, a woman named Gladys, whose eyes held the wisdom of centuries. Gladys lived in a small, peat-smoked cottage surrounded by protective symbols carved into her wooden lintels. "The whispers, dear?" Gladys said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "Aye, Yr Henderbyned. It gathered them. It gathers all who are lost to the CWMD. The valley has hungry roots." "Alara?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gladys nodded, her gaze fixed on the glowing embers of her fire. Alara was taken. She tried to weave her way out, tried to capture the world, to hold it close. But Yr Henderbyned, it held her closer. It wants what it took. It wants to finish the weaving. Finish the weaving? Her tapestry, dear, the one on the loom, it was almost done. She was weaving a path, a portal, they say, to bring her love back from the war. But Yr Henderbyned, it tore her from it, and now it waits. It waits for another weaver to finish its work, to complete the binding. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Binding. The word resonated with chilling clarity. A spirit of the land, gathering grief, holding souls, waiting to be bound by a weaver. This was not folklore. It was a horrifying blueprint. She returned to the cottage, her mind reeling. The air inside felt colder, heavier. The whispers were constant now, a low, guttural murmur underlying the reedy wails. "Mine. You will finish." The deep voice rasped. "Free me, please." The thin voice pleaded. Eleanor stared at the loom, at the half-finished tapestry. It depicted the CWMD, dark and foreboding, its threads woven with impossible skill. The missing section was at the very center, where the ravine plunged into absolute darkness. She realized that Alara hadn't been trying to bring her love back from the war. She was trying to bring her love back from the CWMD, where he had been taken by Yr Henderbyned, and the entity had stopped her, trapping her within the tapestry itself, her soul a thread in its own fabric of torment. Eleanor, despite her fear, felt a surge of resolve. This was a tragedy that demanded an ending, a true ending. She began to study the tapestry, not as an academic, but as a potential weaver. The threads were not just wool. They were woven with hair, with fragments of bone, with dried blood. The same dark, human hair from the previous story's sampler, now resonating with a disturbing familiarity. Ilara's own sacrifice, her very being, woven into her final desperate act. As she touched the threads, the whispers intensified, filling her mind, no longer just from the walls, but from within the tapestry itself. She felt fragments of Ilara's memories, her grief, her fear. She felt the ancient, malevolent presence of Yr Henderbyned, a cold, possessive weight on her soul. "He comes, my Rhys. He comes." Ilara's voice echoed in her mind. "Bind him. Make him mine." Yr Henderbyned's guttural voice responded. Eleanor understood. The entity wanted Rhys, Ilara's lost love, to be bound to it, just as Alara was. The tapestry was a trap, a portal, not for reunion, but for eternal captivity. She needed to finish the tapestry, but not for Yr Henderbyned, for Alara, to free them both. She gathered the raw materials, fresh wool, silk threads, and, with a grim determination, a small silver locket she always wore, containing a lock of her own hair, a personal sacrifice. She began to weave. Each movement of the shuttle, each clack of the loom, was a deliberate act of defiance. As her fingers danced across the threads, the cottage was plunged into a maelstrom of spectral activity. The whispers became screams, the hum a deafening roar. Furniture crashed, unseen hands clawed at her, and the cold became unbearable, a physical agony. The shadowy form of Yr Henderbyned solidified in the corner of the room, a looming, hulking presence of pure darkness, its eyes two burning embers, its presence radiating ancient malice. It shrieked, a sound that tore at the very fabric of reality, as it sensed her intentions. "No, you cannot. She is mine." Eleanor ignored it. She focused on the threads, on Ilara's memories, on the missing section of the tapestry. She wove not a path to captivity, but a path to freedom. She wove light into the darkness, warmth into the cold, a vibrant green of life into the gray despair of the Tiwawemdu. She reached the final thread, the last section of the tapestry. The portal was complete, but it was not the portal Yurhen Derbinud had envisioned. It was a shimmering golden gateway, not to capture, but to release. Yurhen Derbinud lunged, its shadowy form rushing towards the loom, its tendrils of darkness reaching for Eleanor. But she was ready. With a final, desperate act, she wove the silver locket containing her own hair into the last thread, completing the tapestry. The moment the final thread was woven, the tapestry exploded with a blinding flash of golden light. A deafening roar filled the cottage, a sound of ancient power being violently broken. Yurhen Derbinud shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and then, with a final, violent shudder, it imploded, dissolving into nothing but cold, salty air. The profound cold in the cottage vanished, replaced by the natural chill of the mountain air. The whispers ceased. The hum died down. A profound sense of peace, a quiet, almost palpable warmth filled the ancient stone walls. And then she saw them. Two figures emerged from the shimmering golden light of the tapestry. Elara, no longer sorrowful, her face radiant with peace, and beside her, a young man, a soldier, Rhys, his arm around her. They smiled at Eleanor, a look of profound gratitude in their eyes, and then, hand in hand, they stepped through the golden portal, which shimmered once more and then dissolved, leaving behind only the finished tapestry, vibrant and full of life. Eleanor collapsed onto the floor, utterly spent, her body aching, her mind reeling. Her academic world had been shattered, rebuilt by an encounter with true ancient evil and an act of unexpected redemption. She had come to Aberystwyth a skeptic. She left a believer. She finished her commission for the National Trust, but her report was very different from what she had originally intended. She documented the historical weaving techniques, the local folklore, but she also included a veiled academic account of energetic resonance and psychic imprints that hinted at the darker truth she had uncovered. She never mentioned the jinn-like entity or the true fate of Elara and Rhys out of respect, but she kept a small piece of the finished tapestry, a vibrant living green thread, woven with her own hair. She never heard the whispers again. But sometimes, when she was working in her quiet studio, she would catch the faint, sweet scent of mountain wildflowers, and she would know that the weaver's house was no longer a tomb of despair, but a place where ancient grief had finally found its thread of peace. Story 2: The Whispering Pines of Shadow Creek. Detective Miles Corbin, still haunted by the spectral echoes of the Belvedere, had sought refuge in the quiet anonymity of rural life. He'd retired early, trading the relentless sirens of London for the ceaseless murmur of pines in upstate New York. He told himself he was escaping the city's madness, but in truth he was running from the knowledge that the unseen was terrifyingly real, and his rational mind, his very foundation, had been shattered. His new home, a small, isolated cabin on the edge of a dense forest bordering the fictional Shadow Creek National Park, was meant to be his sanctuary. It was a rustic, log-built structure, its windows looking out onto a seemingly endless expanse of ancient, whispering pines. The nearest town, Havenwood, was a charmingly sleepy place, far removed from the brutal realities of urban crime. For the first few months it was bliss. The rhythmic chop of firewood, the scent of pine and damp earth, the vast indifferent silence. It was a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. He spent his days hiking, fishing, and trying to forget the spectral images burned into his mind. He was a man of logic, trying desperately to rebuild his shattered understanding of the world. Then the dreams began. They were not nightmares in the traditional sense, lacking vivid imagery or sudden scares. Instead, they were subtle, insidious. He'd dream of walking in the forest, but the trees would be impossibly tall, their branches forming a suffocating canopy. He'd feel an intense, crushing pressure, a sense of being profoundly unwelcome. an intruder in a place that rejected his very presence. And always, a low guttural murmur, a language he didn't understand, yet somehow recognized as hostile. He'd wake in a cold sweat, the murmur echoing in his ears, the scent of pine needles in his nostrils, mingled with something else, a faint metallic tang like old blood. He dismissed them as the lingering trauma of his past, the subconscious trying to process the unseen. But the feeling began to bleed into his waking hours. As he walked in the forest, he'd feel a growing unease, a sense of being watched from between the closely packed trees. The air would sometimes feel unnaturally heavy, the silence too profound, broken only by the oppressive rustle of leaves that sounded less like wind and more like whispering voices. He began to notice small, inexplicable things around his cabin. His fishing knife, left on the porch, would reappear on the kitchen table. His hiking boots, placed neatly by the door, would be found muddy and outside, as if he'd forgotten them. He blamed his own aging memory, the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Then, the whispers started. They were faint at first, carried on the wind, like the dream's guttural murmur. He'd be sitting on his porch watching the sunset, and a low, resonant sound would drift from the deep woods, a series of clicks and soft guttural exhalations. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't human, it was ancient. He remembered the old legends from his research into Native American folklore for a forgotten university paper. Stories of forest spirits, woodland demons, and shadow people that guarded sacred lands, entities that could manifest as whispers or dreams or even subtle manipulations of the environment. The local Seneca tribes, he recalled, had many such tales, but he was a man of science. One evening, he was cleaning his fishing gear on the porch when the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words. A low, resonant chant, interspersed with a strange, almost guttural language that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. Intruder. Trespasser. The voices seemed to coil around him, coming from all directions. The land. Rejects. Miles froze, his hands gripping the fishing rod. His police training, his instincts for danger screamed at him. This was not a product of his mind. This was real, intelligent, and hostile. He grabbed his powerful hunting rifle from inside the cabin and swept its beam across the tree line. Nothing. Just the impenetrable wall of pines, their shadows long and distorted in the fading light. The whispers ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with ancient malice. He spent the rest of the night huddled inside the cabin, rifle across his lap, every shadow a threat, every creak of the wood a potential intrusion. His sanctuary had become a cage. The next morning, driven by a perverse mix of fear and his unshakable detective's instinct, he sought out the oldest resident of Havenwood, a grizzled old Seneca man named Chief Thomas, who ran a small, cluttered antique shop. Chief Thomas's eyes held the wisdom of generations and a knowing glint that suggested he had seen far more than any city man could imagine. "The Whisper's son," Chief Thomas said, his voice a low rumble, as he examined a tarnished silver locket. "The forest speaks, but sometimes it speaks with an old tongue. The stone giver, they called it. Orendanihi, the spirit of the pines. It watches, it guards, and it does. Not like new roots in old soil." "Orendanihi?" Miles asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chief Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on a worn, leather-bound book behind his counter. It gathered the old ones, the spirits of the land, the knowledge. It held it all. But then, the settlers came. They cut the trees. They built their homes. They spoke of ownership. The Orendanihi. It grew angry. It grew hungry. It sees you, son. It sees your roots are not of this soil. The dreams, the metallic tang, old blood. Miles pressed, his mind making terrifying connections. Chief Thomas looked up, his eyes piercing. The Orendanihi, it feeds on memory, on roots, on what is taken. It leaves behind echoes, whispers, and sometimes a taste of what it consumed, the metallic taste. That is the iron in the blood of the first ones who tried to claim this land without respect. Miles felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This was not folklore. It was a horrifying warning. The Orenda-Nihi, a jinn-like entity, a spirit of the land, was not just guarding the forest. It was actively consuming any who tried to take root without its favor. And Miles, with his new cabin, his new life, was trying to do just that. He returned to his cabin, his mind reeling. The air inside felt colder, heavier. The whispers were constant now, a low guttural murmur underlying a strange, rhythmic click, click, click. It sounded like stones grinding together. Intruder. Your roots. Too shallow. The deep voice rasped, seemingly from the very trees outside his window. The land. Claims. Miles stared at the floor, at the familiar wooden planks. He looked at his hands that had held a badge, a gun, that had sought justice in the concrete jungle. Here, they felt alien, out of place. He realized that the Orenda-Nihi wasn't just trying to scare him away. It was actively trying to unmake him, to erase his presence from the land, to consume his memories, his roots, just as it had done to countless others. He started feeling strange sensations, brief flashes of unfamiliar memories. Images of figures in buckskin, of smoke curling from distant longhouses, of the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. These weren't his memories. They were the echoes of the land, the collective memories of what the Orenda-Nihi had consumed. He needed to fight it. But how? He was a detective. His weapons were logic, evidence, interrogation. None of those worked against an ancient, hungry spirit of the pines. He remembered Chief Thomas's words. It does not like new roots in old soil. He also remembered the tales of offerings, of respect, of seeking harmony with the land. He had to understand its language, its rules. He spent the next few days in a feverish, terrified trance. He delved into every book he owned on local history, Native American ethnography, and natural science. He found references to ancient standing stones in the Shadow Creek region, monuments to a forgotten people, places of power. Stone Giver, Chief Thomas had called it. He found it on an old, hand-drawn map in a forgotten historical society pamphlet. A cluster of standing stones, deep within Shadow Creek National Park, marked as the Whispering Circle. It was exactly what he needed. Armed with knowledge and a desperate resolve, Miles headed into the forest. The air grew thicker, heavier, with every step deeper into the woods. The whispers intensified, now a cacophony of guttural sounds, clicks, and the grinding of stones, coming from all directions. The metallic tang of old blood was strong in the air. The trees themselves seemed to press in on him, their branches forming a suffocating canopy, their shadows long and distorted, like grasping claws. He felt an intense, crushing pressure, a profound sense of being utterly unwelcome. He reached the Whispering Circle. It was a clearing, eerily silent, surrounded by massive, lichen-covered standing stones, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, a single, much larger stone, almost glowing with an internal dark energy. This was the Stone Giver. This was the heart of the Orenda-Nihi. As he entered the circle, the whispers in his mind became a torrent, overwhelming his thoughts, fragments of countless lives, countless memories. He saw flashes of terrified faces, of desperate struggles, of ancient rituals, of new settlers with axes, of blood on the pristine soil. The shadowy form of the Orenda-Nihi solidified in the center of the circle, around the Stone Giver. It wasn't a single entity. It was a shifting, churning vortex of shadowy figures, of fragmented memories, of ancient roots, its form constantly changing, made of pure malice and consumed life force. Its eyes, hundreds of pinpricks of glowing red light, seemed to pierce his very soul. Your roots, they wither. The deep voice rasped, 1,000 voices merging into one. Become one with us. Miles ignored it. He focused on his knowledge, on the ancient ways. He knew the Orenda-Nihi fed on disrespect, on trespass, on a lack of belonging. Its power was in the forced erasure of identity, the consumption of roots. He pulled a small, hand-carved wooden eagle feather from his pocket, a gift from Chief Thomas, a symbol of honor and connection to the land. With a desperate act, he laid it carefully on the central stone giver. "I am Miles Corbin," he declared, his voice strong and clear, cutting through the spectral roar. "My roots are not of this soil, but I offer respect. I offer honor. I acknowledge the ancestors. I acknowledge the spirit of the pines. I am a guest. I seek not to claim, but to understand. I seek not to take, but to live in harmony." As he spoke, the glowing red eyes of the Orendanihi flickered violently. The shadowy vortex around the stone giver recoiled, writhing as if in pain. The atmosphere in the clearing grew turbulent, filled with spectral screams and anguished whispers, no longer threatening but tormented. He remembered a final piece of lore, an offering of memory, freely given, to show true respect for the land's wisdom. He pulled out the silver locket he always carried, the one from the Belvedere, containing a picture of his family, his deepest roots. With a deep breath, he laid it beside the eagle feather. "I offer my memories, my roots, not for consumption but for understanding," he declared, his voice unwavering. "I offer them to the wisdom of the land, not to claim, but to be a part of its memory, with respect." The moment his locket touched the stone, a blinding flash of emerald green light erupted from the stone giver, filling the clearing. A deafening roar ripped through the air, a sound of ancient power being cleansed. The shadowy vortex shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. And then, with a final, violent shudder, it imploded, dissolving into nothing but swirling green light, which then faded, leaving behind only the scent of fresh pine. The overwhelming pressure in the clearing vanished. The whispers ceased. The grinding of stone stopped. The air cleared, light and pure. The profound cold was gone. The Orendanihi was still there, he knew. He could feel its presence. But it was no longer malevolent. It was watchful, respectful. Miles stood there, gasping, utterly spent. His world, once again, had been shattered and rebuilt. He had confronted an ancient evil, not with a gun, but with respect and understanding. He returned to his cabin. The atmosphere was different. The silence was no longer heavy, but peaceful. The whispers were gone. The metallic tang of old blood was replaced by the clean scent of pine. He never left Shadow Creek. He learned from Chief Thomas, immersing himself in the wisdom of the land, becoming a guardian, a mediator. His cabin became a place of peace, a bridge between two worlds. He continued to hike the forest, but now the whispers were different. They were gentle, informative. The Orendanihi had accepted him. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, he would stand on his porch and catch a faint, almost melodic hum from the deep woods. And he would know that the spirit of the pines was watchful, peaceful, and eternally guarding the land, and that, in its ancient wisdom, it had finally found its harmony. Story 3. The Unseen Tenant of Blackwood House. Thomas Blackwell considered himself a master of urban archaeology, not the kind involving trowels and dusty scrolls, but the gritty modern kind, reclaiming derelict properties in forgotten corners of London, stripping away decades of neglect, and transforming them into gleaming, high-end apartments. His business, Blackwell Restorations, was built on the principle that every old building had potential, a hidden beauty waiting to be unearthed. His latest project, however, had begun to test that conviction. It was Blackwood House, a sprawling late Victorian mansion in Hackney, East London. It wasn't just old. It was ancient in spirit, having stood empty for over 60 years, a skeletal monument to some forgotten tragedy. The house was a labyrinth of echoing corridors, crumbling plaster, and dust so thick it felt like snow. The local council, desperate to be rid of it, had practically given it to him for a song, along with a thick file of historical documents that spoke of unusual events and sudden disappearances. Thomas, a pragmatist to his core, dismissed the whispers as urban legend, the natural consequence of a long-abandoned building. He believed in structural integrity, not spirits. His first week was a whirlwind of activity. His team of builders, a mix of hardened East Enders and earnest Eastern European laborers, tore through the house, ripping out rotten floorboards, stripping peeling wallpaper, and dismantling defunct plumbing. The noise was deafening, the dust suffocating, but Thomas thrived on the controlled chaos, the tangible progress. But then, the quiet began to assert itself. It started subtly. The constant hum of the power tools would occasionally falter, cutting out for a few seconds, then sputtering back to life. Radios, left blaring for morale, would inexplicably switch themselves off. Thomas attributed it to faulty wiring, the sheer age of the house. Then, the cold. A persistent, biting chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the building, regardless of the weather outside or the roaring industrial heaters they brought in. It was a cold that settled in the bones, making fingers stiff and breathing shallow. His foreman, a burly, no-nonsense Irishman named Seamus, was the first to voice his unease. "This place has a bleedin' feel to it, Thomas," he grumbled one morning, rubbing his arms. "Not right, it isn't. The lads are talking." Thomas scoffed. "Superstition, Seamus. It's a 100-year-old house. It's bound to creak and groan." But even Thomas couldn't ignore the odd occurrences for long. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in impossible locations. A hammer in the attic, a drill bit wedged into a wall on a different floor. Doors they had propped open would be found mysteriously shut, sometimes locked from the inside. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible above the distant city drone. Sibilant, fragmented sounds like words caught on a distant breeze, always just beyond comprehension. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the deepest corners of the house. He attributed it to the old plumbing, the acoustics of the empty rooms. One evening, working late alone in the house, going over blueprints in what would eventually be the master bedroom, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were words, a low, guttural murmur, interspersed with a thin, reedy wail. "Mine, mine." The guttural voice rasped, seemingly from the walls themselves. "Intruder, trespasser." The reedy voice pleaded from beneath the floor. Thomas froze, his pen hovering over the blueprint. His pragmatism, his belief in tangible reality, began to crack. This was not plumbing. This was not acoustics. This was intelligent, and it was hostile. He grabbed his powerful torch and swept its beam across the room. Nothing, just the shadows dancing. The sounds ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with unspoken things. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his van outside, the blueprint clutched in his hands, trying desperately to find a rational explanation for the irrational. His logical mind, used to solving structural puzzles, found itself utterly at sea. The next morning, driven by a perverse mix of fear and his developer's stubborn determination, he delved into the historical files the council had provided. The unusual events and sudden disappearances now took on a chilling new significance. The house, he discovered, had a grim history. Built by an eccentric colonial merchant named Alistair Finch in the late 19th century, it was rumored to contain objects brought back from his travels in the Middle East. Objects of dubious origin and darker purpose. The first disappearance was Finch himself, who vanished without a trace in 1903. Then a series of subsequent owners, all of whom had attempted major renovations, had either gone missing or suffered sudden violent deaths within the house. The last known occupant, a family in the 1960s, had simply left one day, abandoning all their possessions, never to return. The house had stood empty ever since. He found an obscure reference in Finch's personal journals, a brief, almost incoherent entry about a jinn-bound vessel brought back from the deserts of Arabia, a guardian for his treasures, a protector against those who would steal his secrets. Finch, it seemed, had been dabbling in something far beyond colonial trade. Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. A jinn, an ancient, powerful entity from Islamic mythology, known for its ability to manipulate the physical world and influence human minds. This was not a ghost. This was something far more cunning, far more malevolent. He returned to the house, his mind reeling. The air inside felt colder, heavier. The whispers were constant now, a low, guttural murmur underlying the reedy wails. Mine. Yours now. The deep voice rasped, seemingly from the very stones of the house. Never leave. The thin voice pleaded from beneath the floorboards. Thomas stared at the blueprints, at the plans to transform the house, to impose his will upon it. He realized his renovations weren't just disturbing a spirit. They were actively challenging a powerful, ancient entity that considered the house its domain. The guardian Finch had brought back wasn't guarding treasures, it was guarding the house itself, seeing any attempt to change it as an intrusion, a violation. He knew he couldn't simply walk away. The jinn had already marked him. He had taken possession of its domain. It would follow him. He had to understand it, to appease it, or if necessary, to fight it. He began to search the house with a new intensity, a frantic energy fueled by a dawning terror. He looked for anything that might be the jinn-bound vessel Finch had mentioned. He found nothing obvious. The house had been stripped bare by previous owners and vandals. Then, a new detail emerged. In Finch's journals, he found recurring, almost obsessive references to the house's central chimney stack. Finch believed it was the heart of the house, the conduit through which its essence flowed. He had commissioned a local artisan to carve elaborate, protective symbols into the brickwork, symbols that Thomas now recognized from his research into ancient Middle Eastern protective rituals. He went to the imposing chimney in the Great Hall. The whispers were deafening here, a swirling vortex of sound. The cold was unbearable. He ran his hand over the brickwork, over the intricate, faded carvings. He felt a faint, almost electrical current. As he touched one of the symbols, a blinding flash of light erupted from the chimney. A deafening crack split the air like a violent sonic boom. The Great Hall was instantly plunged into a maelstrom of shimmering, distorting reality. The air crackled with raw energy. He saw it. Not an apparition, but a full manifestation. A towering, ethereal figure, its form constantly shifting, made of pure shadow and swirling desert sand. Its eyes burned with an ancient, malevolent intelligence, and its long, grasping fingers seemed to stretch towards him. This was the jinn, the guardian, the unseen tenant of Blackwood House. The jinn shrieked, a sound that tore at the very fabric of reality. Mine! The guttural voice roared, resonating in his very bones. Thomas stumbled back, tripping over a pile of debris. He lay there, paralyzed by a terror so profound it was physical. The jinn loomed over him, its shadowy form filling the great hall, its presence radiating an ancient malice that felt older than time itself. He heard the whispers again, but this time they were different. They were fragmented, terrified cries coming from within the jinn itself. Help us. Trapped. Not guardian. Prisoner. He realized the terrifying truth. The jinn wasn't guarding the house out of loyalty to Finch. It was bound to it, imprisoned, and the voices within it were the souls it had consumed, the previous owners, the lost ones, all trapped within its terrible essence. Finch hadn't just brought back a guardian. He had brought back a soul trap, a prison that required constant feeding, constant sacrifice. And now Thomas was next. He had to fight it. Not with violence, but with cunning. He remembered his research into jinn lore. They were creatures of rules, of bindings, of contracts. Finch had bound it. He could unbind it. He looked at the chimney, at the protective symbols Finch had carved. They weren't just protective. They were part of the binding ritual. The jinn was anchored to the house, to the chimney itself. He remembered an obscure ritual from an ancient text, a ritual of release. It required breaking the anchor, an act of defiance and a symbolic offering. He needed Finch's journal. He scrambled back to his van, ignoring the chilling presence of the jinn in the hall, which seemed to be toying with him, letting him move, a cat playing with a mouse. He grabbed Finch's journal, his hands trembling. He found the last, most horrifying entry. It described how Finch, in his final act of control, had sealed his own essence within the jinn, becoming part of its power, part of its torment. He was the mine that the jinn always claimed. He was keeping it bound, using his own essence to fuel its malicious power, to terrorize anyone who dared to challenge his domain. Thomas returned to the great hall, the journal clutched in his hand. The jinn was still there, its shadowy form filling the space, its burning eyes fixed on him. "Finch," Thomas roared, his voice strong and clear, cutting through the spectral moans. "Your binding is broken. Your reign ends now." He held up Finch's journal, a symbol of his control, his binding. He tore out the last page, the one describing the binding ritual, and set it alight with his lighter, holding the burning page towards the jinn. "I sever the link," he declared, his voice filled with an authority he didn't know he possessed. "I break the chains. Finch, you are released from your prison. The jinn is released from its torment." As the burning page disintegrated into ash, the jinn shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and then, with a final, violent shudder, it imploded. But this time it was different. It didn't just dissolve into cold air. A torrent of shadowy figures, of fragmented souls, burst forth from its collapsing form, like a flock of terrified birds. They swirled around the great hall, their whispers now pleas of gratitude, their wails no longer torment, but relief. And then they too vanished, melting into the shadows, finally free. The profound cold in the house vanished, replaced by the normal chill of a derelict building. The whispers ceased. The strange hum died down. A profound sense of peace, a quiet, almost palpable warmth settled over Blackwood House. The ancient malice was gone. Thomas collapsed onto the floor, utterly spent. His world had been shattered, rebuilt by an encounter with true ancient evil and an act of unexpected redemption. He had come to Blackwood House a pragmatist. He left a changed man. He finished the restoration of Blackwood House, but his designs were fundamentally altered. He ensured that every fireplace, every chimney, every corner of the house was infused with symbols of protection and harmony, not of binding. He replaced Finch's elaborate protective rituals with ancient blessings, transforming the house from a prison of souls into a sanctuary of peace. He never returned to Blackwood House after its completion. But sometimes, when he was in the quiet of his office, he would catch the faint, sweet scent of distant Arabian deserts, and he would know that the unseen tenant and its unwilling prisoners had finally found their rest. Story 4. The Whispering Well of Willow Creek. Dr. Clara Hammond, an ecological anthropologist specializing in the intersection of human settlement and ancient natural formations, usually found her research sites to be places of quiet, academic contemplation. Her current project, however, stirred a primal unease she hadn't anticipated. It was an abandoned homestead nestled deep in the dense, isolated forests of rural Maine, known locally as Willow Creek Farm. At its heart lay a feature that had drawn her from across the country, an ancient, stone-lined well, rumored to be exceptionally deep and unnervingly old. The well, dating back to before the first European settlers, was said to be a sacred site for the indigenous Wabanaki people. Clara, a woman of science, believed it held significant geological and historical data. Local folklore, however, painted a darker picture. Whispers in the nearest town, Harmony Falls, spoke of the Stone Speaker, an ancient, malevolent spirit residing within the well, a guardian of the deep earth, demanding tribute, particularly the voices of the lost. The homestead itself had been abandoned for over a century after a series of inexplicable disappearances and tragedies that the locals attributed to the curse of the well. Clara, a staunch rationalist, dismissed such tales as charming, if morbid, local color. She believed in data points, not spirits. Her initial days at the homestead were productive. The farmhouse, a gray, decaying clapboard structure, was boarded up, but Clara had secured permits for her research, focusing on the natural environment. The well, located 100 yards behind the house, was a marvel. Its stone lining was perfectly preserved, tapering into a dark, echoing void. The air around it was always cooler, even on the hottest days, carrying a faint metallic scent, like damp earth mixed with old copper. She lowered a sonar device into its depths, hoping to map its structure. The device registered a depth of almost 300 feet, far deeper than any man-made well of that era should have been. And at the very bottom, the sonar picked up an anomaly, a faint rhythmic pulse, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat emanating from the earth itself. That night, the dreams began. They were not nightmares, but more like intrusive thoughts. She'd dream of darkness, profound and suffocating, and an intense pressure, as if she were being squeezed by the very earth. She'd hear faint rhythmic tapping, like water dripping in an endless cavern, interspersed with distant, muffled whispers. She'd wake in a cold sweat, the metallic scent of the well clinging to her, the whispers echoing in her ears. She dismissed them as the natural consequence of her work, her subconscious processing the claustrophobic depths of the well. But the feeling began to bleed into her waking hours. As she worked near the well, she'd feel an overwhelming sense of melancholy, a profound sorrow that was not her own. The air around the well would sometimes shimmer, and she'd catch fleeting glimpses of shadows moving just at the edge of her vision. She began to notice small, inexplicable things around the homestead. Her scientific equipment, left neatly organized, would be subtly rearranged, not moved, but shifted, as if examined by unseen hands. Her recording devices, left running overnight near the well, would pick up nothing but static, interspersed with that faint, rhythmic heartbeat. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, carried on the forest breeze, like the dream's muffled murmur. She'd be taking soil samples, and a low resonant sound would drift from the well, a series of clicks and soft guttural exhalations. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was ancient. She remembered the local folklore, the Wabanaki tales of the stone speaker, an entity that collected voices. She dismissed it as charming, if morbid, local color. One afternoon, she was lowering a spectrometer into the well, trying to analyze the strange metallic scent. The whispers grew clearer. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were words, a low, resonant chant, interspersed with a strange, almost guttural language that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Intruder. Trespasser. The voices seemed to coil around her, coming from the depths of the well. The voices. Mine. Clara froze, her hand gripping the rope. Her scientific training, her instincts for observable phenomena, screamed at her. This was not a product of her mind. This was real, intelligent, and hostile. She grabbed her powerful headlamp and shone it down into the well's dark mouth. Nothing. Just the inky blackness, reflecting the faint light back. The whispers ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with ancient malice. Woman named Grandmother Willow, who ran a small craft shop filled with intricate basketry and beadwork. Grandmother Willow's eyes held the wisdom of generations and a knowing glint that suggested she had seen far more than any modern scientist could imagine. "The whispers, child," Grandmother Willow said, her voice a low melodic rumble as she threaded beads onto a necklace. "The well speaks, but it speaks with an old tongue. The stone speaker, Gawasanaihi, the listener in the deep. It waits, it listens, and it takes what it is offered, especially voices, especially the lost." "Gawasanihi?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grandmother Willow nodded, her gaze fixed on a small, intricately carved wooden figure of a bird. It gathered the old ones, the spirits of the land, the echoes. It held them all. But then, the Europeans came. They spoke of ownership. They spoke of profit. They saw the well as a resource, not a presence. The Gawasanihi. It grew angry. It grew hungry. It still waits for offerings. It still demands voices. The dreams. The metallic tang. The deep pulse. Clara pressed, her mind making terrifying connections. Grandmother Willow looked up, her eyes piercing. The Gawasanihi. It feeds on loss, on fear, on what is taken. It leaves behind echoes, whispers, and sometimes a taste of what it consumed. The metallic taste, that is the fear of those who were lost, their voices still echoing in its deep heart. Clara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This was not folklore. It was a horrifying warning. The Gawasa Nihi, a jinn-like entity, a spirit of the deep earth, was not just guarding the well. It was actively consuming any who ventured too close, collecting their voices, their despair, into its endless depths. And Clara, with her sonar, her probes, her scientific curiosity, was venturing directly into its maw. She returned to the homestead, her mind reeling. The air around the well felt colder, heavier. The whispers were constant now, a low, guttural murmur underlying a strange, rhythmic click, click, click. It sounded like distant chains rattling. Intruder, your voice belongs to me. The deep voice rasped, seemingly from the very depths of the well. Another offering. Clara stared at the well, at its dark, echoing mouth. She realized that the Gawasa Nihi wasn't just trying to scare her away. It was actively trying to draw her in, to make her another voice in its endless collection. She started feeling strange sensations, brief flashes of unfamiliar emotions, images of panicked faces, of desperate screams, of silent despair echoing in the blackness. These weren't her emotions. They were the echoes of the lost, the collective sorrow of what the Gawasa Nihi had consumed. She needed to fight it. But how? She was an anthropologist. Her weapons were knowledge, observation, understanding. None of those worked against an ancient, hungry spirit of the deep earth. She remembered Grandmother Willow's words. It takes what it is offered, especially voices, especially the lost. She also remembered the Wabanaki tales of respect, of seeking harmony with the sacred sites. She had to understand its language, its rules. She spent the next few days in a feverish, terrified trance. She delved into every book she owned on Wabanaki cosmology, ancient earth spirits, and sacred natural formations. She found references to rituals of offering, of acknowledgement, of binding and unbinding entities to sacred sites. She found a complex ritual of return to silence, a way to return collected. Voices to the wind, to break the binding of the Gawasa Nihi from its insatiable hunger. She found it on an old, brittle piece of parchment, tucked into a forgotten anthropological text. A series of pictograms, symbols of release, and a chant. It required an act of pure, unadulterated silence, and an offering of the self, not for consumption, but for connection. Armed with knowledge and a desperate resolve, Clara returned to the well. The air grew thicker, heavier, with every step closer to the well's mouth. The whispers intensified, now a cacophony of guttural sounds, clicks, and the distant, tormented cries of countless voices coming from the well's depths. The metallic tang of fear was strong in the air. The well itself seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, its stone lining almost glowing with an internal, oppressive light. She could feel the intense, crushing pressure, a profound sense of being drawn inwards. She reached the well's edge. It was an echoing void, reflecting only the oppressive darkness. The voices from within were deafening now, a chorus of despair, trying to overwhelm her, to pull her in. The shadowy form of the Gawasa Nihi solidified around the well's mouth. It wasn't a single entity. It was a shifting, churning vortex of shadowy figures, of fragmented voices, of ancient roots, its form constantly changing, made of pure malice and consumed life force. Its eyes, hundreds of pinpricks of glowing red light, seemed to pierce her very soul. Your voice belongs to me. The deep voice rasped, 1,000 voices merging into one. Join us. Join the silence. Clara ignored it. She focused on her knowledge, on the ancient ways. She knew the Gawasa Nihi fed on disrespect, on trespass, on a lack of acknowledgement. Its power was in the forced collection of voices, the consumption of identity. She pulled a small, hand-carved wooden flute from her pocket, a gift from Grandmother Willow, a symbol of communication with the spirits of the land. With a desperate act, she held it aloft. She took a deep breath and began to play. It was a simple melody, a haunting wordless tune she had learned from the Wabanaki elders, a lullaby of the wind, a song of the deep forest, a chant of peace. It was a melody of pure, unadulterated silence. As she played, the glowing red eyes of the Gawasanihi flickered violently. The shadowy vortex around the well's mouth recoiled, writhing as if in pain. The atmosphere around the well grew turbulent, filled with spectral screams and anguished whispers, no longer threatening, but tormented, as if being torn apart. She remembered a final piece of the ritual, an offering of a voice, freely given, not for. She remembered a final piece of the ritual, an offering of a voice, freely given, not for consumption, but for release. She knew what she had to do. She continued to play the flute, her melody weaving through the chaos, and then, with a deep breath, she began to sing. It was her own voice, clear and strong, singing the ancient lullaby of the wind, not as a cry for help, but as an act of profound connection. The moment her voice joined the melody, a blinding flash of pure, vibrant, emerald green light erupted from the well, filling the clearing. A deafening roar ripped through the air, a sound of ancient power being cleansed. The shadowy vortex shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and then, with a final violent shudder, it imploded, dissolving into nothing but swirling green light, which then faded, leaving behind only the scent of fresh pine and damp earth. The overwhelming pressure in the clearing vanished. The whispers ceased. The grinding of stones stopped. The air cleared, light and pure. The profound cold was gone. The Gawasanihi was still there, she knew. She could feel its presence, but it was no longer malevolent. It was watchful, peaceful. Its hunger had been quelled. Clara stood there, gasping, utterly spent. Her world, once again, had been shattered and rebuilt. She had confronted an ancient evil, not with science, but with respect and understanding. She returned to her cabin. The atmosphere was different. The silence was no longer heavy, but peaceful. The whispers were gone. The metallic tang of fear was replaced by the clean scent of pine. She never left Willow Creek. She learned from Grandmother Willow, immersing herself in the wisdom of the land, becoming a guardian, a mediator. Her homestead became a place of peace, a bridge between two worlds. She continued her research, but now her methods were different. She listened to the land, to the whispers of the wind, to the wisdom of the Wabanaki. The Gawasanihi had accepted her. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, she would stand by the well and catch a faint, almost melodic hum from its depths. And she would know that the listener in the deep was watchful, peaceful, and eternally guarding the voices of the land. And that, in its ancient wisdom, it had finally found its harmony. Well, there you have it. You've walked the desolate moors of Aberystwyth, felt the chilling whispers of Willow Creek, and perhaps, like me, you've glimpsed the unseen tenants of Blackwood House and the sky weaver of Holloways End. Each tale, meticulously crafted, is designed to linger, to make you question the shadows just beyond your sight, and to remind you that some horrors are not mere fiction, but echoes of a truth older than time itself. If these journeys into the terrifying unknown resonated with you, if they sent a shiver down your spine or left you peering suspiciously into every dark corner, then I invite you to join our growing community of thrill seekers and ghost hunters. Please, if you enjoyed this story, take a moment to hit that like button and, more importantly, subscribe to the channel. Your support not only helps me bring more such chilling narratives to life, but also ensures you're among the first to delve into our next dark adventure. And for those of you out there who harbor your own chilling encounters, your own whispers from the veil, or perhaps a true story that defies explanation, I want to hear it. If you have a tale that deserves to be told, a real-life horror that truly happened to you or someone you know, reach out. Share your story with me. With your permission, it could be the next terrifying, Narrative featured right here on the channel. Let's explore the depths of fear together. Thank you for watching, and remember, some stories don't just end when the screen goes dark. Narrative featured right here on the channel. Let's explore the depths of fear together. Thank you for watching, and remember, some stories don't just end when the screen goes dark. Narrative featured right here on the channel. Let's explore the depths of fear together. Thank you for watching, and remember, some stories don't just end when the screen goes dark.